Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. So in this video, I want to give you guys my approach to how I would make and construct a high yield portfolio. Now, I don't want to just focus on my favorite ETFs. I'm talking about that. I do that all the time on the channel, but rather I want to focus on the core principles of portfolio management. And what I mean by that is simply what's going to give you the best and most efficient results long term. And before diving deep into the meat and potatoes, I want to quickly go over this article, which is titled Buy, Borrow, Die, How the Rich Stay Rich. And I think this acts as a great reminder to the overall principles I'm going to be discussing later on in this video. So as the title suggests, this is all about learning to invest like the 1%. So step one, quite obvious, is to buy an asset. This could be stocks, real estate, crypto, anything that puts your money to work. And then step two is to borrow against the asset. Now at first glance, this might seem weird, why go into debt and borrow against your assets? But the whole point of this is to tap into the value of your assets in order to fund your lifestyle. That's how the rich operate. With real estate, the way you do this is with a HELOC. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this. It stands for a home equity line of credit. And with stocks, you can do the exact same thing. It's called an SB lock, which is security-backed line of credit. The rich use asset debt, the poor use credit card debt. Credit card debt has high interest rate because the banks are taking huge amount of risk if we default on our loan. And on top of allowing you to access the value of your investment in order to fund a lifestyle, another major advantage of this is what's known as interest rate arbitrage. And this is simply the difference between the rather cheap rate you are charged because you have an asset-backed loan versus what you can earn off of that money. So the rich take advantage of asset-backed loans with much lower interest rate and participate in interest rate arbitrage. The concept refers to the practice of borrowing money at a lower interest rate than the rate at which our stocks or other investments will grow by. And the example here is if you borrow $100,000 at a 2% interest rate, it's going to cost you $2,000. And if you can use that capital to earn a 10% return, then that's a difference or a profit of $8,000. And then the final and most important step here is to die and pass it on. So the goal here is to never actually sell your assets. You just want to continuously accumulate assets because this is where all your value is as a wealthy individual. And in order to access some of that value and pay for things like expenses, you want to borrow against it at a cheap rate because it's an asset-backed loan. And then you simply use the yield of the asset to pay back its own loan. And if there's a gap between what you're paying and what you're earning, you can earn a profit. So hopefully that put us all on the same page when it comes to setting up a portfolio, because you have to begin with the end in mind. So with those long-term outlooks in mind, I think these are some good principles when setting up a portfolio that's going to stand the test of time. So the first one is the basic diversification, but this applies to both the holdings and the strategy of your various ETFs. The next one is fees, because we're going to be holding these assets for hopefully multiple lifetimes, and fees can really eat away at your returns. Next, we have the objective. So we're all a little bit different when it comes to investing and what we ultimately want. So again, begin with the end in mind. And finally, keep it simple. I cannot stress this enough. We want to keep the portfolio as simple as possible while still being effective and efficient. I do believe if you follow these principles, you will have a very effective portfolio over the long term. Okay, so personally, here are a few ways I would go about setting up a high yield portfolio. The first approach is by category. So you can see here I have dividends, index, and growth. Pretty basic. I have a allocation of 30% for dividends, 30% for growth, and 40% for the indexes. And the example holdings here are the S&P 500 as the index, VUG as a broad generic growth ETF, and then SCHD for classic dividends. And if we come back up to the principles I just discussed, we can see how I follow this. I minimize overlap, we still have great diversification, we have an objective, and I'm keeping it as simple and clean as possible. Now, another way I would tackle the same approach, which is by category, is something like this. So we can see here I have the S&P 500 group, the NASDAQ 100, and then specialty. In terms of allocation, I have it split pretty much evenly. And if we take a look at these categories, so this is the S&P 500, and I have two holdings that are based off of the S&P 500, but with different strategies. We have XYLG and JEPI, and then with the NASDAQ, I have the same basic thing going on, but based off of a different index, giving me more exposure to growth and tech equities. And then finally, in the specialty group, we have Divo and BST, and these don't directly correspond to an index. Divo is close to the Dow Jones, more conservative, and BST is tech and software based. So just like before, we're keeping this very simple. We're just grouping the holdings together in a slightly different way, and depending on who you are, your objectives, you might like this setup a little bit more. Now moving on, the second approach here is focusing on strategy rather than category. So again, we have three basic groups. The first one is specialized equities. The second is broad market indexes, and the third is covered call income. And with a configuration like this, I think 40% in the broad market index is smart, and 20% in the specialized and covered call groups. So again, for the broad market index, I have the S&P 500, and that's going to give you great diversification for US equity exposure. And then on top of that, we have more specialized equity holdings that are smaller, giving you exposure to concentrated dividends and concentrated large cap growth in this example. And the point of this is to tack on a bit more exposure to the exact kind of equities you want within the broader market. And then finally, we have the covered call section. And the point of this is to raise the income of the overall portfolio. And here we have XYLD and Divo, two of my favorite covered call income producing assets. But if you're not a big fan of this particular grouping, another way to do it is this right here. So again, we're staying with the strategy grouping approach, but this time it's focusing on systematic, opportunistic, and proprietary. In terms of the weighting, I think the systematic approach is the safest, most predictable, and it follows the indexes. So that's why I gave it a 50% weight and then 25% for each of the others. And here we have XYLG and QYLG. And together they generate you great levels of income and they give you great exposure to the S&P 500 and the QQQ. Then in the opportunistic category, we have Divo and BST, because as mentioned before, they both use a similar strategy of opportunistic covered calls on two very different kinds of equities. And then the final category is proprietary, aka ELNs, and this is JEPI and the new ETF JEPQ. And unlike with XYLG and BST, we don't fully know the research process behind these funds. It's a proprietary process, and on top of that, the ELNs make these ETFs very unique, and that's why I'm grouping them based off of that. So there you have it. Those are 4 various portfolio setups based off of different grouping characteristics. But again, the overarching guidelines here are as following. We want diversification, we want to minimize fees and overlap. Our objective is to have consistent income, and we want to keep it as simple as possible. Because this is how the rich become rich and stay wealthy. They own assets and they never ever sell them. That's gonna be it for the video. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you did and you're still watching, we appreciate a like on the video. Go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.